All right, Mark's Gospel, today's question, who is part of God's family? Who is part of God's family? Do you think you're part of God? Raise your hand if you think you're part of God's family. We'll find out. We'll find out. Who is part of God's family, right? And of course, we're also going to talk about one of those questions that I get a lot. And working as a youth pastor, I got this question a lot from my teenagers. You know, what is the will of God? Usually they frame it this way. You know, I'm just trying to discern what is God's will for my life. You know, should I go to college? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do something else? We'll talk a little bit about what is the will of God. So hopefully we'll answer that question as well. So let's set the context for this particular passage in Mark. This is the very end of Mark chapter 3. I was talking with Deborah this morning and come to find out that, hey, I've only done 12 sermons on the book of Mark so far and gotten through, this will be the third chapter, so you can tell that we're moving quickly. No. Right, so we should finish this up sometime by, I don't know, 2025. I don't know. We're taking our time. We're going through the book of Mark, making sure that we're getting everything in context like it should be. All right, so in Mark chapter 3, some people thought that Jesus was crazy because of things that he said and that he taught, right? So he was forgiving sins. You know, not only is he healing people, but he's forgiving sins. And some of his teachings were striking, especially the religious leaders, as relatively odd. And his relatives come to take custody of him. They're like, they're talking to Jesus' relatives, Jesus, he's a little crazy, and he's bringing dishonor to your family. He's shaming your family. And you need to come and you need to take custody of him and kind of get him out of the limelight so it doesn't look bad for your family. And they kind of come and they're there to take custody of him. And this is kind of where we pick it up, right? When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, to actually take custody of him. They're going to take him home and kind of, put him away like a crazy relative like you do. You kind of just put them in their room. I don't think they had TV at that time, but for people who are saying he's gone out of his mind. Is he crazy? Is Jesus crazy? People are thinking he's crazy and is looking bad for your family. And that's probably the worst thing you could do in this culture, is to shame your family, to bring shame onto your family. Again, I always like to point out that in Western culture, in our American culture, when we read the Bible, we tend to put our own viewpoint into the Bible, where we think about things that are good or things that are evil. And that's not the way the Bible is written. The Bible is written as a battle between chaos and order. And that chaos must be restrained because chaos becomes destructive. But more than that, a lot of what you read in the cultural background of the Bible is that of honor and shame. Things went right and wrong. It's not like this is right and that's wrong. It's that these things are honorable and these things are shameful. And you wanted to avoid certain shameful things that brought dishonor. And so oftentimes we take these ideas of honor and shame, and instead of reading them that way, we read them as right and wrong, quote, good and evil. And so we oftentimes mess up what's actually going on in the Bible. Now his mothers and his brothers show up. So he has this confrontation with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders. He has this confrontation with them. They say he's demonic. And he says, you just committed the unpardonable sin. And now his mothers and his brothers show up, which is kind of interesting because we don't hear too much about Jesus' brothers. He most likely had an unnamed number of brothers and sisters. But we do see there are some of the Gospels that have a list of who his brothers were. But other than possibly James, being maybe the author of the book of James, we're not really sure. We don't know much about what happened with his brothers. Okay, then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. So why are they asking for him? They want Jesus to come outside so they can take him home. Jesus, we got to get you out of this crowd. You're shaming us. So whoever his original kinsman that came, they thought, well, that didn't work. Let's send his mother. Certainly he'll listen to his mother, right? Certainly he'll listen to his mother and his brothers, right? He's got to do what they say. So they send his mom and his brothers over, and they send into the crowd, and the crowd says, they're here. And then Jesus asked, and he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? This is a rhetorical question. How do we know this is a rhetorical question? Because he answers it. Okay. Who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now, a lot of people take this as he was rejecting his family. And that's not what's going on here. He's using a familiar symbolism that the crowd would have known to make a certain teaching point. And he says, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Family resemblance. I put up these pictures, show a little family resemblance there, right? You see the mother and daughter. Do they kind of look the same? Do they kind of act the same, right? There's the father and son, a little looking the same, a little acting the same. I think every human being, I think every girl at some point in her life has that horrifying moment when she does something or says something and it comes out in her mother's voice. Or she realizes that that particular action is exactly what her mother did. Or there's that horrifying moment when she looks at her hands and goes, oh my gosh, that's my mother's hands. Where'd those come from? How did those get on my arm? Right? I think every guy has that same moment too, where you say something and suddenly you're like, wait a minute, that's my dad's voice coming out. He says that. I don't say that. He says that. Or a certain expression, or you look in the mirror and you're like going, what's my dad doing in the mirror? He doesn't belong there. We all have that sort of moment where we realize, oh my gosh, I look just like my family, or I'm acting just like my family. How did that happen? I worked really hard not to do that, and yet here it happened. And so we all bear sort of this family resemblance. You can tell whose family you belong to. In fact, I think that's one of the most difficult things when you get into a relationship, is that you bring all your family stuff with you and you try to join it to another family and you're kind of mixing those. It's like, why are the forks over here? That's not the way see, because that's not how you do it in your family, right? The forks don't belong in that particular drawer and they don't belong in that order. Right? Why are the glasses over it? You don't put the glasses here, you put them down there. That's the way we always do it, right? And we take all this family stuff that's become ingrained in us because we look like our family. That's why when you go over to one of your in-laws' house, you can never find anything, right? You're like, where is it? It's not where it's supposed to be, right? But it's because we carry the family stuff with us. We look like our family. We sound like our family. We talk like our family. I remember one time I was in the airport. I'm in the airport, and I'm just kind of sitting there waiting for my flight, and I see this young lady. I would guess she was probably a teenager, maybe about 16, 17 years old, and she was standing there. She's kind of thin, and she's standing there like this. I thought, well, that's an odd stance. I've never seen anything like that, until I saw her grandmother come up and stand right next to her. I'm like, ooh, I see where you got that from. There's definitely a family resemblance there. I can tell who your family members are. So this is really what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about family resemblance. The word son is used in different ways in the Bible. And it's oftentimes used to relate to a certain resemblance between one thing and another. But let's talk about the different ways it's used. One, it could be a direct male descendant, but generations can be skipped. This is why sometimes when we're doing genealogies in the Bible, it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. There's some generations missing here. It's because even though they say, so-and-so son of, it could actually be a grandson or a great-grandson, but some kind of direct male descendant. But you can even skip some certain generations. It could be a person who is younger and socially inferior. I think they use this more in the South, where they might be like, well, son. You're not actually a descendant of him, but you're just indicating that they are of a younger and socially inferior status than you. It means to follow in someone's footsteps, to emulate another's actions, to carry on and to an extent fulfill the Father's life and purpose. So we could almost call this like a disciple of somebody who has attached themselves to someone else, and they're following in their footsteps, they're imitating them, and they're carrying out their mission, they're carrying out their purpose. So a lot of the disciples would have been sons of. And so sometimes you see that in some of the listings of people, son of this, son of that. For example, Paul, right? He was the son of, anybody remember who his teacher was? Gamaliel. Okay. Zacchaeus is called a son of Abraham because he's fulfilling the purpose and the mission of Abraham. In Galatians 3, verse 7, it says, so you see those who believe are the sons of Abraham. Why? Because we are fulfilling the messianic promises that were given to Abraham. Right? It was said that he would have many, many children, as many as the stars in the sky, as many as the sand on the beach. And so all of us who believe, who have entered into the kingdom of God, we are his children because we are fulfilling his mission. We are fulfilling the promises that were given to him. So we become sons of Abraham. Son of was also used metaphorically to identify one's nature or a personality trait. See, we would say you're the son of so-and-so because it tells us a characteristic of who you are. For example, oftentimes they'd say, well, he's a son of Aaron. It meant you were a priest. If you entered into the priesthood, you were a son of Aaron. You may not be a direct descendant of Aaron, but you were considered, this is a characteristic, this is part of your nature, that you serve as a priest. A son of Asaph was a singer. If you were a singer within the temple, if you were somebody who led worship, you were considered a son of Asaph because you were like him. You were doing the same things that he does. Son of Chemosh, this means that you are a Moabite idol worshiper. So if you worshipped the particular god, Chemosh, you were a son of Chemosh. You were like them. You were fulfilling their purpose, their mission. So whoever you were, quote, a son of, told us what your character and personality was like, what your nature was like, who you are. And so that's kind of what's going on here. Jesus extends this analogy not to just son of, but to other family members as well. Mother of, brother of, sister of. So he's extending this analogy, right? He asks rhetorically, who is my mother or brothers? Who are they? Well, if they're really my mother, if they're really my brothers, there should be a family resemblance. We should have sort of the same nature and personality. We should be aiming for the same goals. We should be fulfilling the same purpose. There should be a family resemblance here. You can tell who my family are because they're going to look like me. And then he answers it. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Because what was Jesus doing when he was walking the face of the earth? He was fulfilling the will of God. He was following after the very purposes, right, and goals of God. He was fulfilling it as he walked the earth. So anybody else doing that becomes his brothers and sisters and his mother. They are part of his family. They bear the family resemblance. Does that make sense? Good, everybody's tracking. Those who do God's will, like Jesus, are like him. They are recognizable by their family resemblance. So, how can I tell whether or not you are in the family of God? You should be doing the things that Jesus was doing. You should look like he is, like he did. Your words and your actions should be similar to his. That's how I know whether or not you're part of the family of God. You should be doing the will of God. Jesus wasn't rejecting his biological family, and I've heard some people teach that. He was rejecting his biological... No, he wasn't. He was using a metaphor to teach the importance of doing God's will. You want to be part of the family of God? Then be doing God's will. Be like the Father. Do his will. Fulfill his purpose. Now, here's the tough question. What is God's will? And like I said before, I see people struggle with this all the time. I see them struggle with this all the time. They're like, oh, I just don't know. Should I go off to college? I'm just trying to discern whether or not this is God's will in my life. It's like, really? What major should I take? Which instructor should I take? I'm just wondering if I should take a vacation this year, if that's God's will for me to take a vacation this year. And if it is God's will, where should I go? If I go to Fiji, Or if I go to Hawaii, which will bring God more glory? And I'm like, okay, I don't think these are the questions of God's will, right? I don't think we should struggle this much over thinking that these kind of minute details about whether you go to Fiji or Hawaii for your vacation is really all part of God's will. But somehow it got trained into us that we have to, question our every action to make sure it aligns with God's will. And we can't figure, it's very difficult to figure out God's will for our life. So we got to pray about it and ask our friends about it. We got to go to prayer meetings about it. Search the scriptures for it. Oh Lord, should I go to Fiji? And Judas hung himself. I don't know. What does that mean? How does Hebrews apply to my vacation? I think we get off track. I don't think God is too terribly worried about that kind of minutia. I think God has set us on a general course towards reconciliation towards Him, and we have some freedom to move around. We're not into some kind of being like a puppet where everything we do is controlled and we're in God's will or out of God's will. Oh Lord, is it your will this morning that I eat Lucky Charms? And there are some people who are paranoid enough about that. I'm like, you need to get off of that. Depending on which religious group you belong to, you're going to get different answers, depending on what kind of church you go to. Well, I think it's God's will that every man and every woman should get married to each other. I think it is God's will that all the men should go into missionary service. Not necessarily. I know a lot of people who are missionaries that really shouldn't be, and I know a lot of people who are pastors who should not be. But they were told that was the will for their life by their religious leaders, and it wasn't. And yet there they are. Since Jesus is the full expression of who God is, since Jesus is God incarnate, since He's the full expression of who God is, and we look at the book of John, John states it as He's the Logos. He's the absolute expression, the full and complete idea of who God is and what His purpose and will are. We must do the things that Jesus did and follow His instructions to do the will of God. Jesus manifested exactly what the will of God was by living it out in front of eyewitnesses. And so when we begin doing the things that Jesus did and teaching the things that Jesus did, then we are fulfilling the will of God. We must imitate Christ. So what is the will of God for you? To imitate Christ. Oh, so I need to get a robe and some sandals and to be an itinerant preacher and just kind of wander around with like 12 other guys? No, not that much of imitation. Okay? But we need to be imitating what He did for people, His compassion, His mercy. We need to be imitating what He taught. He taught a message of the kingdom being at hand. He came and He set the captives free. Are we setting the captives free, or are we just putting more bondage on them? Are we putting more religious bondage upon people? Are we binding them like the Pharisees did to a bunch of religious do's and don'ts and regulations? Or are we setting them free? What are we doing? We have to imitate Christ. He was a liberator. We have to imitate Christ. He preached mercy and compassion and grace. He offered forgiveness freely. Do we offer forgiveness freely? The will of God, and I think we can trace this arc all throughout both the Old and New Testament, is to reconcile all of creation to Himself. Now, I think we can all admit the world does not work in the way that it should be. Creation has a problem. And that mankind in general, human beings in general, have sort of turned their back on God. They're not following through on God's will. And God's will is to reconcile all of creation, every human being, and even the world itself, back to Himself. He loves His creation. He loves His creation. And He wants to be back in relationship with it, reconciled back to Him. That's what He wants to do. That's His will. In Colossians 1:19-20, it says this: in Him, we're talking about Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. He's our ultimate example. And through Him, to reconcile to Himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of His cross. That's what he wants to do. See, God has already declared peace. I'm not fighting you. I'm not against you. I'm not at war with you. But there are human beings who are at war with God. They're still declaring war. And he still wants to reconcile with them. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to harm you. You declared yourself my enemy, but I'm declaring you my friend. Come, let us reconcile. It kind of sounds strange if you go to some fundamental churches. We're at war, we're at war. God hates this, God hates that, God is at war with this. We are his soldiers and his army. If you're in one of those churches that like couches everything in military terms and that we're at war, run. Time to get out of that church. You need to leave because God has declared an end to the war. He's not at war. He's already won. He's done. And some human beings may still be fighting God, but he's like, it's okay. Throw your tantrum. When you're done, I'll still be here, ready for you, to pick you up, to comfort you, to bring you in. I'm going to reconcile with you. That's my goal. That's my will, to reconcile. The will of God, how do we as human beings participate in this reconciliation? How do we reconcile all of creation back to him? How about surrender? I surrender. I'm no longer, I didn't realize the war was over. I didn't realize you weren't at war with me. I surrender. I surrender. That's one idea. But more than this, by following the commands of God. This is how we do it. By following to do his will, follow his commands. Jesus gave us an example of somebody living in total obedience to God. And so we should live in total obedience to God. But then we run into that other terrible question. Well, what exactly did God command? What exactly did he command? And depending on where you go and what church you go to are all the rules and regulations, and they will even have Bible verses, says right here. It's like, where'd you get that? Oh, that's in Leviticus. Really? You're using the old Levitical law? See, even the first century Christians said those don't apply anymore. Why do we keep digging these old Levitical laws back up and trying to reapply them here in the 21st century when even the first century Christians said they're done? Why do we do that? Because it's more about control than following the will of God. What commands did Jesus give us? And then everybody who's sitting in the church is like, oh, here he goes again. It's that same old sermon. Well, yeah, I have to keep preaching it until everybody gets it, right? Matthew 22, 36 through 40, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? In other words, which one do I really have to do? What's the most important one? What do I really have to do? There's a lot of commandments out there, Jesus. And we got commandments about, things like if we're camping, we're all out in the desert and we're camping, where do we put the poop? That's in the Bible. Where do you put the poop? Do we still have to do that today? I point that out because, back in the 17 and 1800s when indoor plumbing was like not a thing, a lot of churches resisted putting indoor plumbing for bathrooms into the church. And they cited the verse that, that you have to put that stuff outside the camp. Can't have it inside the camp. They're like, well, we're all camping here. This is like our camp, so you can't have it inside. They didn't want any indoor plumbing. I think it was more like a cost-saving measure. But hey, you can justify anything. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Which one do we really need to do? And everybody replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets hang on these two commandments. This is what Jesus taught us. Here it is. You want to know what you want to do? You want to fulfill the will of God? You want to reconcile the world to yourself? Here it is. Fulfill these two commandments. That's it. Done. And in fact, even as you move along in Judaism, there later rabbis would even preach this and teach this. Here it is. Here's the summary of all the law and prophets. All the old Torah, the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, and all the prophets, all the rest of the books of the Bible. Here it is. Here's the summary. Here's what you need to do. Now there's a very important phrase, and the second is like it. See, Jesus has reconciled us to God. The job's done. Now we just have to live that part out. Now, if for us to participate in the reconciliation of all of creation through following his command, love God, love your neighbor. That's how we participate. Love God, love your neighbor. And the second is like it. See that second part, love your neighbor? That's the most important part for us. And this is the part that fundagelicals and all the rest of us tend to mess up. See, it's an idiom. It's a phrase that doesn't mean literally what it says. It doesn't mean that they're similar. It means they're exactly the same. If the second one is like it, it means that the second one and the first one are the same command, and you do the first one by doing the second one. An idiom that means that they are the same command. You love God by loving your neighbor. How do you love God? How do you love God? You know, because I see people, they're like, I just love Jesus so much. And they go to church and they raise, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Oh, I just love Jesus. I just love Jesus. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I love you, Lord. Oh, yeah, but I hate that person and that person and that person. That person's a drag queen and that person's LGBT and that person over there is a drug user and that person's like an illegal immigrant. And I just hate them. Okay, yeah, see. You can go to church and do that and say how much you love Jesus, but if you're not loving people, you're not loving God. You've broken the command. You're not doing the will of God. You're not participating in the reconciliation of all of creation. Because every one of those individuals that you quote hate bears within them the image of God, the imago Dei, the image of God. In the book of Genesis, it says that human beings were created in the image of God. Each and every one of you bear the image of God within you. And we can see it. Well, what does God's image look like? I mean, does God have arms and legs? No, not that kind of image. We're talking about the moral character of God. Who he is, his nature and personality is within you. And I can go around and I can begin to see it because different parts of it manifest in different ways in all of you. So that when I look at you, what I should really be looking for is God's character beginning to manifest within you. And that even all those nasty people that we supposedly hate and should hate, they bear that image. And so if you hate them, you hate the image of God within them. And you're hating God. 1 John 4:20. Those who say, I love God and hate their brother or sisters are liars. Let me say that again. If you say you love God, but you hate your brothers or sisters, which is all the rest of humanity, then you're a liar. Please step down from your pulpits, preachers. If any preacher stands up and begins preaching a hate message, they are not a messenger of God. They are not speaking the truth. They are liars. And they should be removed from the pulpit. I hear some of these hate preachers sometimes, they get up there and they're pounding the pulpit and they're yelling and they're screaming. God hates, and they'll name some group. Liar. You are preaching a false gospel and a false message. God hates no one. He's reconciled himself to all of creation. If you say you love God and you hate your brother or sister, you're a liar. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. Because when you look at your brother or sister, you are looking at the image of God manifested in front of your face. So if you hate that, how can you possibly love God? How can you possibly? You're not even seeing him because you can't see him in your brother or sister. Wow. See, so that's how this whole love God, love your neighbor are actually the same command. You must love your neighbor, your brother, your sister, all the rest of your family members within humanity, because if you can't love them, you can't possibly love God. Again, any preacher, any teacher that teaches hate, that you need to hate some group, they're false teachers, they're false preachers. They should be removed. Back to the family resemblance. John 13:35, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. Everybody will know you're following after me. Everybody will know that you're one of mine. Everybody will know that you're in the family if you have correct doctrine, if you hate all the same people I hate, No. If you love one another. What is the mark that says, hey, this is one of mine. This person is part of my family. This is my mother, my brother, my sister. This is my disciple. This is the one who belongs to me. They love one another. Love one another. So when we're not loving one another, which is everybody, not just the people in the church, which is everybody, then we know you're one of his. We know you're part of the family. Getting it? Have I driven this point home? All right. Having driven the point home, how do we live this out? How do we worship God? See, and that's really what we're doing. We're loving God and we're worshiping God when we actually enact it. How do we love God? By loving our neighbor. How do we live this out? What should we be doing? Well, if you're marked by love, okay, if you're not marked by love, you are not part of the family of God. You need to start questioning yourself. Am I showing love to other people? If you're not part of the family of God. You've gotten off track somewhere. I'm telling you, there are churches filled with people who are not part of the family of God. Because their entire teaching revolves around political issues and hating certain groups rather than loving humanity. See, we can tell because you don't bear the family resemblance. Loving someone, and so here we got, well, how do you love? What does it mean to love someone? Well, loving someone means actively working to do what's best for them. Actively working to do what's best for them and not causing them harm. Not causing them harm. Now, this month is June, right? So we're filming this at the end of June. You probably won't see it for a couple of weeks. You'll probably see it in July or August by the time you actually see this. But this month is June. And this is Pride Month. And you're going to see a whole bunch of fundagelicals in their church pulpits foaming at the mouth. Pride Month of the devil. We should be killing them. We should be executing those people. Not causing them harm. I hear some of these crazy people say the stupidest thing. Well, why don't we have straight pride? I don't know, because you're not discriminated against. Maybe because you're not part of that group that in certain countries around this world could be executed. And you're trying to bring that here to the United States. You're actively working to cause harm to a certain group of people. Maybe that's why we have to have Pride Month. Maybe because you're not trying to make it illegal and throw them in jail. Maybe you're not trying to prevent them from all the benefits that a marriage provides. Maybe you're actively trying to harm a certain group because you don't like them or you were told that God doesn't like them. That's why we don't have straight pride, because you're not part. That's never happened to you. You've never had anybody decide on the validity of your fourth marriage. You've never had anybody who are like, well, let's go ask the Supreme Court whether or not they can marry. You've never had anybody decide whether or not you get thrown in jail for loving who you love. That's why we don't have straight pride. There's too many groups working within the church to actively hurt people. Every time I hear somebody say, oh, I just love triggering those liberals and making them cry. I'm like, really? That's very Jesus-like. You're actively working to harm somebody? You're obviously not marked by love, which means you're not part of the family. Get thee behind me, Satan. Loving somebody means actively working to do what is best for them and not causing them harm. Now, here's the danger though. Beware paternalism. Paternalism is where we decide that some group, they're childlike. They're not mature enough. They're not capable of running their own lives. There's something wrong with them. And so we, the morally superior ones, the better ones, must decide what's best for them and do it for them. I'm doing what's best for them because they can't determine what's best for themselves. The United States is guilty of paternalism like crazy, especially in the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt said of the people in the Philippines, we have to take care of our little brown brother. They've become the white man's burden. Okay? I have a few choice words for that, or as my father would say, pardon my French. That's paternalism, where we infantilize a certain group of people, that they're not capable of taking care of themselves, and so we have to do it for them. We need to get rid of that idea. And instead, we need to come alongside of them as equals and work for their actual good by maybe listening to them and knowing because they do know what's good for them. We see this in the deaf community as well, especially when it comes to deaf education. This may shock you. Deaf people actually know the best way to educate other deaf people. So why do hearing people keep coming in and telling them the best way? And saying, well, this is actually the best way. Paternalism. Not what we think is best for them, but doing what actually is best for them, listening to them and finding what's best, listening to them and finding out what will actually help them grow, listening to them and finding out what will actually help them flourish. In a beautiful, open, loving environment, that's what helps people flourish. Loving behavior, by the way, is righteous behavior. We're called to righteousness. We are told that righteousness will lead us to the blessed life, that we can live the best life here and now in this world if we act in a righteous way. And righteous behavior is loving behavior because it treats people in a fair and equitable manner. Anything that is not fair and equitable towards another human being is not righteous. Anything that makes another human being lesser than is not righteous. Evangelical Church, I hope you're listening to this, you big old patriarchy that thinks women are second-class citizens. You are not practicing righteousness. You're not practicing love. Loving behavior is righteous behavior, and of course, righteous behavior is loving behavior. You want to be righteous? You must be loving. You must treat everybody in a fair and equitable manner. You must be actively working to do what's best for them. The golden rule, right? Do unto others what you would have done unto you. Active. Oh, there are a lot of other people who said it the other way around. Don't do to others what you don't want done to you. Be very passive, just don't do stuff. But Jesus told you to be active and go out and do it. Do unto others. You need to be proactive in how you love other people. You need to be actively working for their good. And you need to be actively avoiding any kind of harm. That's being righteous. That's going to lead you to the blessed life. That's going to mark you as a disciple of Jesus. That's going to mark you as a member of his family. That's how I can tell when you're truly a Christian. With that, let me close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just pray for our entire nation. We have groups and groups of people in our nation who are actively working to harm others, who have labeled certain groups as lesser than, or as evil, as undesirable. And we have actively worked to harm them, to please ourselves. Lord, forgive us. Lord, may your Holy Spirit go out and soften those hearts. May the truth of your message go out and let them know that we must be loving people, that we cannot claim to love you unless we love everyone else. Help us with this hard truth, Lord. We just pray this in your name. Amen. Today, if you found this content helpful, be sure and like this video and share with a big thumbs up. Make a comment, especially if you can, make a comment. It helps our community here as well as our YouTube channel, so we thank you very much for that. With that, I'm going to close out in this benediction. How do you know you're part of the family of God? Well, you bear the family resemblance. You're doing the will of God. Oh, well, what is the will of God? Well, to reconcile with all of humanity. How do we do that? By loving one another. It really all comes down to love. It's all about love. So let me close with this benediction. As you leave this place, may you know God's will and do God's will to love one another. God bless you all. Go in peace. You are dismissed.
We are one in Christ. We are one in God. We are one in unity. We are one in truth. We are one in faith.